Thank you, Dr. Ali, and welcome everybody. It's always a pleasure to see you here, all many good friends. We enjoyed the presentation by Dr. Mansour earlier, and his talk about the vote of 6 against the world reminded me of a funny anecdote I'd like to share with you. So this old lady calls her husband and says, "Honey, I know you're driving. I heard there is a crazy old man driving against the traffic." So he calls her back and said, "Honey, you don't know. Everybody is going against the traffic." So with that, we're going to use technology for our panel. We have one of the panelists that's going to be joining us by Skype, and a distinguished professor in London lost power in his house. He was supposed to join us by Skype, but we have his presentation. I would like to remind you to please silence your cell phones. I heard one ringing here. I'm sure by now you all know the rules for the questions and answers, and when the time comes, I might repeat those. And for those who are joining us online, they can send their questions through Twitter to @PalestineCenter. And for those who want to follow us, use the Twitter handle of #PALCenter18. With that, it is my pleasure to say some words about our speakers. Some of them, 2 of them are not here, but I know the presentations, the resumes are with you, but we have people outside watching on Twitter. The first one is Dr. Salman Abu Sitta. He's the founder and president of the Palestine Land Society, dedicated to the documentation of Palestine's land and people through atlases, articles, reports, and books, including those that he authored, such as The Palestine Nakba, the Register of Depopulated Localities in Palestine, and From Refugee to Citizen at Home. In addition, he's the author of recent memoir, Mapping My Return, which he describes as less a biography and more a mapping of his return, and in which he chronicles not only the dramatic events on the eve of the Nakba, but also the subsequent experience of his life in exile, from his family's flight to Gaza, his teenage years as a student in Nasser's Egypt, his formative years in the 60s in London, and his life as a family man and academic in Canada up to 1991. Zena Agha, to the far right, is the US Policy Fellow of Al-Shabaka, the Palestine Policy Network. Her areas of expertise include Israeli settlements building in the occupied Palestinian territory with a special focus on Jerusalem, modern Middle Eastern history, and spatial practices. She has previously worked at The Economist, the Iraqi Embassy in Paris, and the Palestine delegation at UNESCO. In addition to opinion pieces in The Independent, The Nation, Zena's media credits include the BBC World Service, BBC Arabic, and El País. Zena was awarded the Kennedy Scholarship to study at Harvard University, completing her master's in Middle Eastern Studies. The third panelist is Lamis Deek, who had an emergency, could not be here in person, but I hope that to be joining us by Skype. Is a Palestinian attorney and human rights advocate in private practice based in New York, and chief counsel to the Global Justice and Human Rights Law Network. In her private practice, she has litigated Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim civil rights and criminal issues ranging from free speech and free worship to state oppression and trumped-up terrorism charges. Internationally, Lamis handles matters related to anti-corruption, human rights abuses, and complex litigation by mobilizing legal, political, media, and grassroots resources to produce comprehensive and effective results. Ms. Deek regularly lectures on a broad range of issues related to Palestine. She is also a frequent lecturer on issues related to government surveillance, discrimination, and predatory policing and prosecution of Muslims, Arab, and Palestinian communities. She's a member of the National Lawyer Guild, a longtime member of the Al-Awda New York, the Palestinian Right to Return Coalition. She serves as advisor to CARE and other nonprofit organizations, and is a co-founder of the Popular Assembly of Palestinians in North America, and is a part of a growing international movement for the prosecution of war crimes in the MENA region. Josh Ruebner, to my immediate right, is a policy director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. He's the author of Shattered Hopes, Obama's Failure to Broker Israeli-Palestinian Peace, which outlines the Obama administration's policies towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and suggests forward steps to help achieve peace and Israel, democracy or apartheid state, which draws on personal anecdotes, historical documents, and legal analysis to examine Israel's current status as an apartheid state. Ruebner is a former analyst in Middle East affairs with Congressional Research Service and holds a graduate degree in international affairs from Johns Hopkins. Each panelist will speak for 15 minutes, and there will be time for questions and answers afterwards. And the rules for those, again, should be remembered. So it's my pleasure to have Josh Ruebner kick off this panel discussion. Josh.
Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to thank the Palestine Center for inviting me to speak here this morning. The U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights is a national coalition of more than 300 organizations across the country, including the Palestine Center as one of our longtime members and supporting organizations, so it's always good to be back here. Today we're convening this annual conference of the Palestine Center in the midst of what could be argued as an unprecedented crackdown and repression by the United States against the Palestinian people and against their legitimate rights. We see this take a myriad number of forms, from the cuts to UNRWA, to the ending of bilateral quote-unquote humanitarian assistance from USAID, to the closure of the PLO office in Washington, D.C., to the transfer of the U.S. Embassy to Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and to the dissolution of the U.S. Consulate General in Jerusalem, which is actually, I believe, one of, if not the most significant of these Trump administration efforts to repress the Palestinian people, even though in many respects has gotten the least attention of the Trump administration's many moves to repress the Palestinian people. And the reason why I believe that's the case is because it marks a very significant policy shift in the way that the United States thinks about its relationships with the Palestinian people. The U.S. Consul General actually predates the establishment of the State of Israel by some 80 years, and actually predates the establishment of the modern Zionist movement by 20 years. And it's an institution which has always operated separately and independently from the U.S. Embassy to Tel Aviv to be the reporting channel to listen to the interests of the Palestinian people and report that directly back to Washington, D.C., without the interference of the embassy in Washington. And so for the Trump administration to subsume the Consul General within this new U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem and to create within the U.S. Embassy to Israel an Office for Palestinian Affairs, despite Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announcing that this does not affect any so-called permanent status negotiations or positions of the United States. It actually does, because the United States is now articulating that it sees its relationship to the Palestinian people as officially a subset of its relation to Israel. So why is the Trump administration engaging in all of these steps to repress the Palestinian people? In my estimation, it's an attempt, a very heavy-handed attempt, to weaken and soften the Palestinian leadership in an attempt to get it to capitulate to what Trump has euphemistically referred to as the, quote, deal of the century, his plan to establish a permanent Israeli-Palestinian peace. Now, it should be noted from the leaks and the bits of information about this so-called deal of the century, which have trickled out over the past year or so, that it does differ in some details from previous U.S. quote-unquote peace plans, but that it actually does not fundamentally differ in substance from previous offers made to the Palestinian people under the Clinton administration, under the George W. Bush administration, under the Barack Obama administration, which were, of course, all plans pre-coordinated and preconceived between Israel and the United States in an attempt to impose it on the Palestinian people. So under this plan, the quote-unquote state-minus aspects of the so-called Palestinian state that would arise are more explicit, more blatant than under previous plans. Israel might annex more of the West Bank under this plan than under previous plans, but in substance, it does not differ fundamentally from previous plans. The plan always was for a state minus. The plan always was for the Palestinian entity not to be a sovereign state, not to have an army, not to have an independent foreign policy, not to have any control over its borders, its airspace, its sea lanes. This was always the plan. The Trump administration has just made that plan much more explicit. And so in addition to the repression that we're seeing the Trump administration engage in toward the Palestinian people in an attempt to get them to capitulate to U.S. and Israeli demands, we're also seeing intense repression facing people who advocate for Palestinian rights within the United States and indeed across the globe. We're seeing this through the Trump administration in the appointment of Kenneth Marcus to be the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights within the Department of Education. This is the job within the Department of Education that looks into allegations of discrimination and bigotry towards students on college campuses. And Ken Marcus comes to this position from a Zionist organization whose primary and sole mission was to file false allegations of anti-Semitism against student organizers for Palestinian rights on campus. In all 5 or 6 of the investigations that Kenneth Marcus either filed or conspired to help file, the Department of Education threw out these charges as being baseless and said that advocating for Palestinian rights constitutes legitimate political expression on campus, even if people are uncomfortable with it. What Kenneth Marcus has failed to do from the outside, he has been brought into the government by the Trump administration to now accomplish from within. And so already, he was just confirmed a few months ago, already he has reopened closed cases into alleged acts of anti-Semitism. And he has unilaterally decided that he is going to impose this redefinition of what constitutes anti-Semitism to include legitimate political criticisms of Israel within the orbit of that definition, so that the force of the federal government will now come down on student organizers for Palestinian rights who are advocating successfully on their campuses to pass boycott and divestment resolutions and to label them anti-Semitic for doing so. This attempt to repress coming from within the Trump administration is coupled with attempts coming from within Congress to repress on many different levels. And what I'd like to do is to point your attention to 3 pieces of outstanding legislation, which may or may not get debated and voted on in the 3 remaining weeks we have left in this congressional session. Number 1 is something called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. This is a bill that would take what Kenneth Marcus is doing within the Department of Education and mandate that the Department of Education use this flawed definition of anti-Jewish bigotry as its standard for adjudicating whether there is bigotry on college campuses. Basically, it would be enshrining in law what Ken Marcus is already doing through the Department of Education. Number two, I'd like to draw your attention to something called the Combating BDS Act, which is being pushed by Senator Marco Rubio in the Senate. This is a bill that aims to encourage states and localities to pass the exact same types of laws which have been declared unconstitutional by two federal district judges that, in essence, punish people by refusing them contracts with the state for supporting boycotts for Palestinian rights. And the third and most draconian of the bills being debated in Congress relating to the repression of activism and advocacy for Palestinian rights is the Israel Anti-Boycott Act. This bill not only seeks to punish and harm people who advocate for Palestinian rights, but actually to throw them into jail for up to 20 years. This legislation states that if you provide information to, or if you advance an international organization's call to boycott Israel or even Israeli settlement products, if you do this, you are liable to criminal penalties of up to $1 million and 20 years in prison. With this amount of outright repression being openly and proudly debated by some in Congress, one might take it as a sign that Israel and its supporters are stronger than ever in this country. But I believe that the reverse is actually true, because all of this repression is not a sign of strength. You don't need to engage in repression if you think that you are winning. You engage in efforts to repress and to silence because you are on the losing side of history. And so I view this as an indication that we collectively are on the right track in advancing Palestinian rights in this country. Now, I would be a very bad organizer if I was all doom and gloom and did not leave you with at least a grain of hope. But I actually see much more than a grain of hope, not on the long-term horizon, but on the short-term horizon. And let me tell you why I think that the repression of the Trump administration, of Congress, of Israel is failing in 3 different reasons. Number one, this direct Trump administration efforts to repress the Palestinian people in order to get them to try to capitulate to U.S.-Israeli demands has backfired. Even the compliance Palestinian Authority, which has been so quick to enter into and continue and to perpetuate this charade of negotiations for 25 years, even this attempt to crack down on the PA and to pressure it has backfired, with the positions taken by the Trump administration being so extreme that PA President Mahmoud Abbas has cut off all contact with the administration, and the feeling is mutual. No longer do we have a fig leaf of a dialogue. No longer do we have the fig leaf of Israelis and Palestinians sitting down together around the negotiating table. But we have a clear scenario in which it is the United States and Israel which is attempting to dominate and dictate a one-sided outcome, something which was already there, but it's just much more obvious now to everyone that this is the case. Number two, the attempts to repress people who are engaged in advocacy for Palestinian rights in the United States has also backfired tremendously. And even though you now have states, about 25 in number, which have passed laws to punish people who support boycotting for Palestinian rights, the negative ramifications and the pushback for engaging in this type of blatant behavior to silence our First Amendment right to engage in boycotts has been tremendous. So the fact that you have these laws introduced and passed at the state level and attempts to do so at the federal level has brought the American Civil Liberties Union onto our side, clearly defending our right to engage in this type of advocacy and these types of boycotts. And in fact, as I alluded to earlier, the ACLU, which is arguably one of the most influential civil society organizations in the entire country, has filed and successfully won 2 court cases challenging laws that have attempted to punish people who support boycotting for Palestinian rights. And in both cases, the federal district judges have, for the first time, set a precedent that, yes, indeed, we have a constitutional First Amendment protected right to engage in boycotts for Palestinian rights. And we also see that this repression at the congressional level has mobilized the ACLU to oppose all 3 bills which I alluded to earlier, placing us in the ACLU in one corner and Israel and its supporters in the opposite side, and that's absolutely a fight that I want to have, and I think that we can win. Number 3. The identification of the Trump administration, not only with Israel, but with the extreme right annexationist apartheid impulses of the most right-wing government in the history of Israel, has not only enabled and continued a process of creating a partisan divide on this issue, but it has established a firm partisan divide. Republicans are now the party of Israel, and Democrats are the ones who are questioning that relationship, and in many cases, upending it. And so we heard a little bit about the results of the midterms, and we can look to innumerable public opinion polls to affirm this yawning chasm between the base of the Democratic Party and the base of the Republican Party. We see that there are now 31 Democratic members of Congress who are supporting, in this current congressional session, the first ever bill to advocate for Palestinian rights, unabashedly, without any mention of Israel's quote-unquote security. To say that abusing, interrogating, and in some cases torturing Palestinian children through Israel's military detention system is wrong, immoral, and no U.S. aid should be used for that purpose. We have a representative-elect, Rashida Tlaib, who not only supports a one-state resolution, but also supports sanctioning Israel until it ends its human rights abuses of the Palestinian people. And just the other day, we had another representative-elect, Ilhan Omar, from Minnesota, not only say that she supports our right to engage in boycott for Palestinian rights, but supports BDS. These type of developments were unimaginable in Congress even a year ago. And so I believe that if we work smart and if we work hard over the next 2 years and continue to seed this transformation that is beginning to manifest itself at the grassroots of the Democratic Party and now up to Congress, we will be in a position to create the fundamental transformation that we need to achieve Palestinian rights in 2020. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh. I believe we have Lamis on Skype. All right, that'll be our next speaker.
Okay, Lamis, can you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you from before. Can you hear me and see?
Now we can hear you.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Go for it.
So thank you, Mohammed, and the Jerusalem Fund for accommodating the Skype intervention. I extend my apologies to everybody. I really wish I could be with you. And I want to give a special shout out to the women I had hoped to see. Samira Saoud, thank you for all of your work and for this event. Suhair as well. It's good to see you. I could see you from here. I'd like to begin my portion by first and foremost, because I think it's always important for us to begin at the beginning which is our people in Palestine and honoring our fallen heroes in Gaza, especially those who we lost over this weekend, and who in their sacrifice and in their act of what I think is the purest form of love, a not self-interested love, gave their lives to protect the 2 million people in Gaza who are imprisoned by Israel, and whom without the resistance are but 2 million hostages and walking targets of the Israeli colonizing project for ethnic cleansing, in particular the sacrifice of Sheikh Nuruddin Barakeh, Mustafa Odeh, and Muhammad al-Tatari, which brought to Gaza and Palestine a tremendous victory by their discovery of an Israeli military cache inside of Gaza, which preempted a broader massacre, saved countless Palestinian lives, and materially protected the global struggle for peace, at which Palestine is most centrally situated and for which Palestine is best poised to push forward. BDS is our only form of indirect accountability, and the Palestinian resistance is the only form of direct accountability and preemption of Israeli violence that Palestinians have. And so it is my hope that we normalize and elevate the Palestinian resistance. Now, much like we saw stem from the attacks and violence and massacres in Gaza, especially the latest, what we see, as Josh touched upon, in the expanding circumference of Zionist and Israeli repression and violence, even in the US, is an exposure of Israeli weakness, an exposure of Israeli arrogance, in which is an opportunity, and of course, an exposure of their desperation. I'll address the dangerous repression that has plagued first and above all Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims in the United States, and which has had consequences far graver than what we see in the academy. Now, I personally join you as a member of an organization, perhaps one of the only organizations in the US that has endured and fully and unequivocally defeated some of the most concentrated liquidation and counterintelligence efforts of Zionists and US forces of repression. I myself was a primary target of this operation, which we deduced over a period of years, and which began on the same day that the Mavi Marmara was raided and continued until at least 2015. Palestinian repression of Palestinians in the US did not begin after 9/11, but was a part of US policy for decades. In fact, Nixon's Operation Boulder of the 70s and the Supreme Court's ruling related to this, that US executive agencies are permitted to implement foreign policy by targeting dual nationals inside the borders of the United States, is piece and parcel and the original codification of the right to repress Palestinians and Palestinian speech. So what Josh was talking about is actually a reversal of the court's policy and pre-existing policies, and taken in context is actually a huge victory. Now, post 9/11, as many of you know, Palestinians, Palestinian organizations, Palestinian communities were the first and biggest target of the Patriot Act and its execution throughout the United States. I was practicing at the time, and I had already come to defending the Palestinian community even before I graduated law school. And so what we were watching were surreal, and I mean this with no exaggeration, surreal levels of very militant, made-for-TV type of surveillance. And case after case that appeared before the courts or in the news, framed as some big, terrorist plot, were manufactured cases that had been begun or were developed and prosecuted at the behest of and in coordination with Israeli and Zionist operatives and think tanks right there in DC. And so it was in these cases that we first saw, right? We have to understand how this is all tied. And it was in these cases that we first saw the actual criminalization of speech on Palestine, even before it had reached the legislative effect. It was in the executive agencies, both state and federal, meant not just to chill speech on Palestine, but to terrorize and destroy entire communities in the US and to break their relationship with international networks in support of Palestine. And it should have been, it should have been scary at the time, but it got worse. Around the same time, the NYPD, in coordination with the CIA, which is not allowed to operate inside US borders, though I've caught them doing that several times, in coordination with the CIA and in coordination with Israel, had set up a secret, illegal unit operating in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and likely elsewhere that was modeled precisely on the Israeli network and surveillance and control practices and policies used in the West Bank. So we had inside the United States a mechanism modeled and coordinated with the Zionist entities' practices and policies of controlling, killing, and colonizing people. And this was implemented in the United States. Now, their tactics were so thuggish and so brazen and so arrogant that it was because of their infiltration of our organization, with the exposure and our ability to decode what they were really doing, that not only led to the dismantlement, for the most part, of this unit, but even caused and birthed and really succeeded in removing, the sacred, at that time, police commissioner Ray Kelly from his post. And so our, ragtag operation, which had a budget of anywhere between $1,000 and $3,000 each year, defeated a multi-million-dollar NYPD project with the might of Israel behind it. And that is a tremendous, tremendous victory. Now, our organization was, let me start by saying this. I use this as an example, and I've got countless more, perhaps, that are better, but I'm here and I'm trying to keep it short. What I want us to take away from what Josh said and what I'm trying to convey to you are a few points. Number one, we cannot and we must make sure that we study and understand the detailed minutiae of coordination between Israel, the United States, and international forces of repression. An example. At the same moment that the Mavi Marmara was being raided, if everybody's familiar with the Mavi Marmara, May 2010, yes, I see heads shaking. At the same time that the Mavi Marmara was raided, Obama dispatched a team of lawyers and strategists from the United States to Israel to help save Israel from its legal and PR nightmare. On that very same day is when the NYPD sent 2 undercover agents to infiltrate our organization, which would, really deplete our resources, though we defeated them, deplete our resources for approximately 5 years. On the anniversary of Nakba, almost every year for a number of years, various agencies, federal and state, would parade around a case that involved Palestinians, even when it was a blatant lie, and it often was a blatant lie, to the point that judges would tell the prosecutors, what does this have to do with terrorism? This is a regulatory case. This is a criminal case. But they would parade around so as to criminalize and deplete any resource they could for the commemoration of a Nakba. This is how detailed the coordination is between U.S., New York, state, federal agencies and Israel. And it's important that we understand that there are no coincidences and that we prepare for this. Number 2, we should know and always keep in mind whenever we're dealing with any case that no case that we're addressing, whether it's the legislation, the campus cases, the actual criminal prosecutions, nothing is isolated. This is internationally coordinated on every level. And so our approach to this must also be multi-layered and cross-continental. We saw that in the adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism in the UK. Not 2 weeks later, it's being used by the Department of Education here. And lastly, in all of this, even in the legislation, the infiltration that we endured, it's important that we are very attentive to what's happening, and know that if we employ just a modicum of creativity and courage, we have many gains to be made. I'm going to use myself as an example. There is nothing particular about me other than I work hard, and I hope, inshallah, that I'm very committed to my people here and in Palestine. And in my practice, I've lost very few cases, alhamdulillah, but I take no credit for this, right? One case I lost and it was reversed on appeal, a political case. Another, we had to take the offer because it was too good to pass up. And the third was an issue of proportionality. But all of the cases that I've won in my practice, domestic or international strategizing, were always a result of mistakes made specifically because of government arrogance, and they're kind of getting high on their own power. And like Josh said, in this arrogance are critical opportunities for us to seize. Like I said, our organization, $3,000 at best, our annual budget, we're able to take down and render useless a multi-million-dollar project, right? And second, the wholesale unmasking, of even the facade of diplomacy, and the exposure of Israeli desperation, brute violence, brute repression reveals a deep fear, which is, and exposes them. And that's a lot easier to address and push back against than what we saw under the Obama administration, which is this invisible, omnipresent, kind of unable, you can't convince people it's happening. And so for years we were forced to work alone. And so it's an opportunity. And I bring that, and I say this to Riyad Mansour's point as well. Yes, the nation state law is horrible. But in this is the only time that we are seeing the UN trying to hold Israel accountable for its finally honest admission that it is, in fact, an apartheid state. Some might think that the closure of the PLO mission is a problem. Maybe, maybe not. That's not my perspective, quite frankly, because what I see happening, and if you know the conditions of having the PLO mission in DC, I mean, they were so horrible that the PLO mission was effectively made hostage, right? It was controlled by these awful conditions which prevented the PLO mission and thereby the Palestinian Authority from protecting and acting in the interests not just of Palestinians in Palestine, but of Palestinians in the US. So what does this mean for us? This means for us the peeling of the facade of an administrative layer that serves our interests, opens the door for us to become creative and to take up those spaces and to undo the failures of those conditions of having that mission here based in DC. So this is a tremendous opportunity. I do not see this as a defeat. And lastly, for some perspective again, and to bring it back to Palestine, in 2014, the entire Palestinian gross domestic product, the entire Palestinian GDP was $7.5 billion. In that same year, the Israeli military budget alone was $23.5 billion, excluding another $3.5 in direct military aid from the US. So 7.5 billion Palestinian GDP to 27 billion just on military spent on a starved, besieged, Bantustanized, if that's a word, occupation, and still the resistance in Palestine, the resistance in Gaza, not only defeated them strategically and militarily, but politically and psychologically won hearts of the masses across the world. And if they are able to do this, we are capable of so much more. All we need is some courage, some commitment, and some elbow grease, right? No cause and no case has ever been won by the timid. And in closing, to bring it back to the Great Return March, it is unfortunately a failure of our negotiators that for 70 years we have left the Palestinian right to return as a footnote, right? And in post-Oslo, having it as that footnote is what has really defeated, strategic gains for Palestinian return and liberation. What we saw the Great Return March do just in the past 5 months was more productive and more materially beneficial to Palestinian return. And again, I say in real, direct, material ways, therefore, more beneficial to the struggle for global and regional peace and stability than people in DC and London and Ramallah have been able to do for 50 years. So we are not to underestimate the importance of this moment. We do not need to revive Resolution 242. We need our people to lead the way and for us to follow and support them. And I thank you, and I hope to add more later.
Thank you, Lamis. You opened my eyes and the eyes of many people here to practices and policies that are taking place. And thank you for your activism. I must admit here, I'm a great fan of lawyers as of today. So our next speaker is Zena. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you for the Palestine Center for organizing your annual conference. I was here last year, so it's nice to be back and see the same event happen again with such gusto. And thank you to Lamis and to Josh and to Salman for joining us on this panel. My name is Zena Agha. I'm the US Policy Fellow for Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and we aim to advocate for Palestinian rights within international law. And our network is spread all over the world. Very happy to say that a few members of the panelists here today are part of a Shabaka. Although my areas of expertise do lie in settlements and in spatial and mapping practices, lately I've been completely consumed by what's been happening with UNRWA and with the cuts to refugees and the threats to the right of return. And I think, if you'll indulge me, I want to spend the time that I have exploring that subject, because I think that it's, if we're not careful and if we don't mobilize around it, it really will pass us by. As my co-presenters have demonstrated, it's clear that the Trump administration has a very close ties with the right-wing nativist government we're seeing in Israel, and has given a green light in unprecedented ways. We saw this in Jerusalem, of course. We saw this with the green light to settlements, including many settlers and pro-settlement advocates who are actually in the administration itself, which is unprecedented. And Israel really has a green light to act as it pleases in a way that it never has before. But I think it's important to also stress that this isn't a break with the past in as much as a deterioration of a pre-existing condition. The Trump administration is perhaps just more open and more naked in its approach to vilifying Palestinian rights, but it wasn't the first to come out with a policy for attacking Palestinians. This has been a long-standing approach by Western governments, particularly the United States, in shutting down Palestinian claims for sovereignty, for return, for self-determination. The latest casualty of Trump's attacks, of course, have been the Palestinian refugees. And before I go on and talk about the details, I have a central point, and I think it's very clear that this comes across. Let it be perfectly clear that underlying all of these political machinations, this is an attempt at depriving Palestinians of their inalienable right to return to their historic homeland, and therefore do away with their claims of millions of Palestinian refugees worldwide who are caught in political limbo and have been for the last 7 decades. UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is a UN body designed to deal with Palestinian refugees, was founded in 1949, the year after the State of Israel was created, to deal with some 750,000 Palestinian refugees who were recently expelled or displaced from their homelands and who were forbidden from returning. And they spilled over into neighboring countries. Today, that number has grown to 5.3 million registered Palestinian refugees in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, that's within historic Palestine or Palestine, Israel, but also in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, and really all over the world. UNRWA as an organization provides much needed healthcare, food, education, vital services which really are indispensable to the Palestinian refugees. And I think the result of which has, Palestinians are some of the most educated demographics in the region. Palestine has more university graduates than any other Arab state. And this is largely in thanks to the robust education system that UNRWA has in place. But I think it's important to also stress that the relationship with UNRWA has never been a rosy one. And I think in defending UNRWA, as I am today, and as I hope many people in this room are, it's important to flag that unparalleled support really isn't what we're asking for here. Nobody likes to be dependent on aid, least of all Palestinians. In the way, if one were to hear the remarks and the support that Trump and Haley and that whole gang have attacked UNRWA, you would really think Palestinians relish being on aid, and they would relish the fact that they cannot return to their homelands, and that they should be grateful for the pittance that they have been given. And of course, the relationship between Palestinians and UNRWA, the UN body tasked with caring for them, has always been necessary but uneasy. And I think this is something that is important to remember as we're critical of UNRWA, but also as we work to defend UNRWA. It has, for all intents and purposes, become a welfare government in exile. It doesn't have no political mandate, but it provides all the services that a welfare state would. And of course, prior to the PLO's assumption of leadership in the mid-1960s, it really did operate as a state for Palestinians to advocate for their rights. Today, however, UNRWA operates as a versatile and diverse and robust political entity. And the fact of the matter remains is there is no alternative to UNRWA. The size, the scale, the funds that UNRWA operates, there's really nothing to compete with it. Just take, for example, that 70% of Palestinians in Gaza rely on UNRWA for support, and bearing in mind that of the 2 million people trapped in Gaza, 1.8 million of them are refugees, one starts to understand the scale of the problem. Now, of course, as many of you are aware, the Trump administration on the 31st of August of this year decided to cut all aid, all funding that they provide to UNRWA, bearing in mind that they had been, up until this point, the largest donor to UNRWA, describing it as an irredeemably flawed operation in the press briefing. And cut what would amount to $300 million from the organization, roughly 30% of its overall budget, leaving the organization scrambling and really putting at risk the lives of refugees, not in an esoteric way, but tangibly. Hospitals are no longer able to provide for Palestinian refugees. Schools might not be able to reopen come the start of the new semester. Very real-term, profound impacts on the day-to-day existence of refugees who are already so squeezed and in many cases so desperate. As far as the US and Israel is concerned, the crime of UNRWA is to perpetuate the refugee issue or crisis and validate the right of return to Palestinian refugees. And they do this, according to Israel and the US, by granting descendants refugee status. So if one was displaced in 1948, their kids and their descendants would also be considered Palestinian refugees with the same rights that international refugees worldwide are accorded and upheld under international law. And this isn't an uncommon practice. Places with protracted conflicts have always had this sort of practice. Somalia, Afghanistan, Sudan, I can go on. Now, the administration has devised a very clumsy and reckless way of dealing with this. And in many ways, it epitomizes the Trump administration's approach to dealing with issues that it cannot solve. Instead of actually going to the root of the problem and facing it at face value and dealing with it, what they've done is this gerrymandering, this demographic manipulation, whereby only those surviving refugees get awarded or given refugee status. That is to say, of the 750,000 Palestinian refugees who were displaced during the Nakba, or the loss of the Palestinian homeland in 1948, it's estimated that about 20 to 30,000 of them are still living. A number significantly smaller than the 5.3 million registered refugees. And the theory goes that if you gave these 20 to 30,000 Palestinian refugees, many of whom will die over the next decade or two just with the passage of time, you can redirect money away from UNRWA and give it to the host nations, that is to say Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, for resettlement or assimilation, and therefore do away with the idea of Palestinian need for return and Palestinian political claims. And of course, this does all center on a political grievance. The Trump administration isn't as concerned with Palestinian healthcare, public health or public education, in as much as it is the political legitimacy of the Palestinian cause itself, which, as Trump often talks about, does not go away. But what Trump and his ilk have fundamentally done is misdiagnose UNRWA as the source rather than the product of the refugee reality. And I think this is the really pivotal point here. Palestinian refugees will remain whether or not UNRWA is there to deal with them or to care for them. And rebranding Palestinian refugees doesn't stop them from being refugees, which is a status enshrined in international law and UN resolutions like UN Resolution 194, which gives the right of return. The UN did a very good job of fleshing this out in a recent policy paper which came out last week, highlighting that 1, UNRWA has not and cannot change the definition of a Palestinian refugee. 2, you can absent UNRWA, but Palestinian refugees would still exist. And 3, both UNRWA and UNHCR recognize descendants as refugees. What Washington fails to grasp is the root of the Palestinian grievance, and I think this political moment that we're in, that Josh and Lamis have touched upon, opens the door for these sorts of conversations. The Trump administration can continue to meddle with the semantics of the refugee status and try to bleed the resources from the institutions that sustain refugees, but the Palestinians' demand remained unshakable, unforgettable, and very, very clear. They were displaced from the lands from which they came, and they demand to return to them. In such a circumstance, Trump is merely shooting the messenger. By going after UNRWA, this really isn't doing away with Palestinian refugees at all. It's just pushing it under the rug and making Palestinians yet more at risk and more dependent on an international body, which for the last 70 years it has no choice but to work with. Which really brings me up to this political moment that we're in. And I think this is something I just want to spend some time exploring, and I hope that we can speak a bit more about this in Q&A. But how are we to understand this political moment that we're in? The status quo from all sides have reasoned that the status quo is very, very untenable. The two-state solution is all but null. I know that that is contradictory to some of the other speakers here today, but that's certainly my position. And we should, my personal belief is that we should take this horrific cut to refugees as a rallying cry for shedding light on the Palestinian right of return. And if we were to take Gaza alone just as an example, not only because it's been in the news, but I think it's perhaps the most illustrious case of what I'm talking about, the fact that the tiny strip has been under siege for the last 11 years is preposterous. There needs to be an honest conversation about the blockade. No longer is it a conversation about providing fishermen with more nautical miles or negotiating a botched ceasefire or providing cancer patients with care. Of course, all of that stuff is of pivotal importance, but I think it's important for us, particularly sitting in the West, to take a step back and look at a more holistic picture. Why is there still a siege in place? And why do Palestinian refugees still not have the right to return from the lands from which they came? And this, since the pro-Israel side of the debate has been very clear that Palestinians cannot and will not return to their lands. This is a political moment for us to say, actually, no, the right of return is, instrumental to understanding Palestinian liberation, Palestinian emancipation, and Palestinian sense of self and sense of statehood. So, yes, the right of return is the central pillar of Palestinian liberation, and I think it's high time that we listen to that message. And I say this not because we are the ones, or Washington is the one that decides many of these things, but Palestinians themselves have been saying this. It's just high time that we listen to them. And I'm talking in particular here of the Great March of Return, which has been going on since Land Day in March. Week on week, Palestinians have walked up to the arbitrary border fence which separates them from their historic homeland, have been met with live ammunition, with disproportionate force, over 220 of which have died, the number is still rising, and 20,000 Palestinians have been maimed, particularly in injuries to the legs, which permanently disables Palestinians. they have titled that the Great March of Return. For them, return has never been a question, a contentious or a polemical issue. It has been at the forefront of Palestinian demands. They recognize the state of Israel as their historic homeland, and they've articulated a peaceful resistance movement which directly targets it. And in case there was any ambiguity, they've called it the March of Return. So I think it's high time that instead of us here as commentators thinking about the nuts and bolts of the day-to-day reality and how can we alleviate it and how can we make incremental gains, I think it's time that we recenter right of return as the central pillar of Palestinian identity and Palestinian liberation, but also understand that Palestinians themselves have been leading the movement for the last 70 years, both in Palestine, Israel, in the region and abroad. And it's just a question of listening to those demands. Palestinians have never given up the right to return to their historic homeland, and that I think is something that in this political moment that we're in, as heinous as the current administration is, it has provided an opportunity for us to actually have a frank conversation and say, right, we are at this political juncture, and it's high time that we have a conversation about how right of return is not an appendix to any future settlement. It's not an appendix to Palestinian liberation. It's at the forefront of Palestinian claims. And in closing, I just have a few recommendations. Since we work in policy, it's always nice to end with some recommendations, even if they never bear fruit. The first is that civil society members, many of whom are in the room today, should raise awareness of bills that actually fundamentally threaten Palestinian rights. And Josh did a very good job of highlighting three that are targeting Palestinians right now. And it's time that we make politicians accountable to these things. And this is something that the pro-Israel lobby has done very well. It's a single issue organization, and they say we mobilize politically around this one issue. It's high time that pro-Palestinian supporters actually adopt a similar practice whereby say your political accountability is you're accountable to us and our demands are X, and making sure that our politicians take heed and that there's a political price that comes with not supporting Palestinian rights. And I think, seeds of hope, but I think the Democrats taking the House last week, particularly a few members of the Progressive Caucus who are now, progressive candidates who will now hopefully walk the corridors of power and start to speak a bit more vocally, as we've already seen with Ilhan Omar, and shed light on these very crucial issues. We're starting to see a change. I think it's important not to over-labor it, but just to recognize that there are seeds of change. Second, critical members of Congress and civil society should keep a close eye on Trump's policy towards settlements. And I say this because Trump has done a very good job of putting pro-settlement advocates like David Friedman and others right at the forefront of his administration, both in terms of making them ambassadors, giving them high-profile positions, hiring his son-in-law to be a special advisor. And there are strong links not just with the Israeli government, which in itself is quite a shocking situation, but actually also to the settlement movement. And so we should keep a close eye on settlements insofar as what the Trump administration seeks to do to simultaneously take it off the table and legitimize what's already been done. And third, and perhaps most obviously, nation states should continue to fund UNRWA at all costs and make sure that the organization doesn't sink and doesn't become completely overwhelmed. UNRWA, for better or worse, employs a vast number of Palestinians, many of whom rely on it for their livelihoods. And until there has been a just and lasting peace, UNRWA really shouldn't go anywhere. So I'll end it there, and I look forward to discussions and Q&A.
Thank you, Zena, very much. And in a few minutes, we're going to have Dr. Salman Abu Sitta address the group. I'm going to be a conspiracy theorist and say they cut the electricity off London so he cannot join us. Yeah. This is a videotaped presentation that addresses the subject at hand.
We have to think of Palestine, its land and its people, and the law applicable in this case. The land, luckily for Palestine, during the British mandate and before that the Ottomans and the United Nations, we have complete record of ownership of the land in Palestine. I have, and in Palestine Land Society, 500,000 records of individual names and where they own. So we have no problem with that. The people, will talk about that in a minute. But the law, we have, a regime of international law which is ready for application, starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the covenants against racism and so on, and also self-determination and 181 and 194 and so on. But let us talk about the people, because the land is sitting there. We know who owns it. We know they are refugees, but we know who owns it. And the law is there. Now let us talk about the people. If we talk about the people, my figures here about 2008, but it applies. You will find inside Palestine today, the blue column is the Jews, but the top tranche is 300,000 of foreign workers. The bottom one, below that, is 1 million Russians, and the rest are Ashkenazis and Mizrahi, okay? With them, at that time, the Palestinians are about 4.5 million. Now they are more than that. But you see the black dots on the red. These are refugees of those. So more than half of them are refugees. But out of now today, Palestinians are 13 million, and half of them are outside Palestine. Look at the column on the right, outside Palestine. The absolute majority of them are refugees. Now, okay, so let us look at Palestine today. I'm talking about Palestine, which is called Israel. And let us examine who lives in the land of those refugees today. We know who lives there. We know where they came from, and we analyze that in detail. I'll show you a result of that. Palestine, during the mandate, has been divided administratively into 1,100 towns and villages. Each one of them has a town or village or more, and it has an area belonging to that village. So we call this village land. Village land is different from the village itself, the village land like that. So we examined how many people living there from the Israel Statistics Bureau, and we found that all the green areas have today no Jews or Jews less than 5,000. Almost 472 villages have practically no Jews, or absolutely zero Jews, or Jews less than 5,000 in each of them. And the documentation is available for someone there. So then the next step will be to see where is the land of the Jews. It is the same like I showed you earlier. That's the land they owned during the British Mandate. And they lived mostly on that land with a little spillover. We'll explain that. Here, for example, we have the cities. The cities are, especially the coastal cities, are mixed population. So the brown area indicates the land of the cities. Cities have a different treatment. But then, where are the Jews occupying the land of Palestinians with a large majority? They occupy the Palestinian land with a large majority, over 30,000, in the dotted areas. You see the dotted here, few of them in the south and the north. Only in that area. The Jews today are majority over the absent Palestinians. Now, next step will be to see in terms of size, proportional size, where do the Jews live? You can see easily where do they live. In Tel Aviv area, and in Jerusalem to the east, and in Haifa. The three dots at the bottom, big ones I told you about earlier, they are Asdod and Al-Majd al-Asqalan and Beersheba. But most of the Jews live in Tel Aviv area, of course absorbing Jaffa, and about a dozen villages there, and same in Jerusalem West and in Haifa. Now, we can then say to Palestinians, you can return. The red dots are Palestinian villages. They can return. They will all go to the green area where there is nobody there or very few people who are there. There is no obstruction to the Palestinian refugees returning in the structure of today. I'm talking here about villages, rural villages. I'm excluding, of course, cities which have a different kind of treatment. We'll come to that in a minute. So actually, this is not a new invention. It's probably obscured from literature, deliberately or otherwise, by the Israelis. This map, this table, is done by Israel 2020. A big plan started in 1995 saying what Israel would look like in 2020. It's an Israeli document which shows that 88% of the land in Israel today is controlled by the army and by kibbutz but the population centers here are less than 8% in 2020, and they are 5% in 1994. Spaces and centers. And the military, of course, occupies all that. So here we have what you all know, but you are afraid to say. Israel is a military base, basically, with people in it. It's a huge military base. It's the largest military base from Paris to Peking. That's a fact. Now, we then should say, let us look again at Palestinian villages, and we see that these are Palestinian villages depopulated. The green section of the village are people who found refuge in Gaza, and the brown section of the circle are people who found refuge in West Bank and Jordan. So we can send them back to their villages. They don't need ships or airplanes. They can actually walk. It's within bus ride. We can repeat the same experiment for Galilee. And here there are already, in the purple dots, there are Palestinians already there. And if we bring the refugees back, they will add only a small thing. Half the population in Galilee is Palestinian anyway, and those who come from Syria and Lebanon will hardly add to the whole picture. Now, this is the nice part, but the difficult part in the center, as I said before, around Tel Aviv and so on. What shall we do with that? Well, we can think. For example, we can create cantons. So we create canton Tel Aviv. I have added here in blue the settlement blocks of Jews today in Tel Aviv area. Now, I added also black areas. You can see them black, not here, shown here as being brown. I added this to connect the cantons. This canton actually contains a very large number, almost 3/4 of the Jews in Palestine, in Israel. And the rest of the areas, as I explained before, the dotted one are Jews living in Palestinian land, but the situation is much simpler. One thing I should add very quickly, that if you actually impose on that, the built-up area today, the built-up area, the expansion, urban expansion today, it does not cover more than these areas. We have another example for a camp in Gaza, Nusayrat camp. Here is the camp, and here are the villages where they come from, and we can lead them to go home. Okay, but they will go home to a deserted place, demolished houses. So we have to think of how we can rebuild these houses. The staging of the return is very straightforward. For example, out of 4.6 million, when the refugees from Gaza return, the number of refugees dropped to half. And then from Jordan, they dropped by 1 million. So actually, it can be done in about 4, 5, 6 stages in about 6 years. Now, we will bring them back to a deserted place. We have to see how we can house them in their location. This is Tantura, with the massacre of Tantura. We actually digitized the aerial photographs. We created a complete map of the village, and with names of houses and so on. This took 5 years at least, but now we have 10,000 files on all the villages. We know what they are like. We know the people there, We know who owned them. We know which refugee camp they live in. We know the road from the refugee camp to this. But then we did something else. We have to see what is the situation today in that village, in Tantura. Yes, 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 coming close. So this is the location. Now we need to build that, rebuild the destroyed. So we made a plan with Palestinian universities that the graduating class of architecture, each one should select a village and had to give a graduation project of reconstructing his village. And this is one example of the winning design in London last year. One student designed Tantura again. We have a jury for this, and the jury distinguished architects from Germany, England, and Ireland, and Arab countries. And this year, we have 8 universities participating, not only in Palestine, but also in Jordan too, and the American University of Beirut. And next year, year 3, the competition will be among all universities in the world who would like to do that. Now, let us consider the facts. These are all facts, of course, but let us consider the facts about Israelis first. Fact number 1, Israel occupied all of Palestine by military force. And there is no legal justification whatsoever. And there are no borders. And there is a pile of UN resolutions against that, number 1. Fact 2, Israel enjoys unlimited support of the United Nations and the variable support of some Western countries. Fact 3, Israel is an important weapons and cyber products exporter. Economically, it's very robust. Half of the Israeli companies are listed in the New York Stock Exchange. The bond between Israeli economy and the European countries and the United States largely reflects the Jewish power in these countries. So no doubt about that. But actually, according to an extensive study which I mentioned earlier called Israel 2020, there will not be in Israel, there should not be in Israel, they say, Israeli study says, in Israel more than 8 million people, million Jews anywhere. Why? Because there are many reasons listed in 3 big volumes on that, because they wanted them to be in Europe and America, better for Israel. So they don't plan that. There is also a constant flow of Jews leaving Israel. As you know, 750,000 are said to be living abroad. We hear about 70,000 people applying for their German citizenship. But are they abandoning ship? No, I don't think they are abandoning ship. But that means the status quo is not stable. Now, let us look at the facts about Palestinians. I'll finish. They were 1.5 million in 1948. Now they are 13 million. In year 2030, Palestinians will be 18 million. Half of them on Palestine soil, and the other half are on the borders within 100 miles of the border of Palestine. They have no tanks, I'm sure. They have no airplanes. And in Palestine, they are either second-class citizens. We have discussed that. But many Arab regimes today abandon them. Of course, good old friend Trump and cohorts entered the scene as a bull in a china shop, and they destroyed international law. It doesn't look very pretty. But, here is the but. They have been in constant state of struggle for 100 years since the infamous Balfour Declaration. And they stood their ground for 6 major wars and hundreds of air, sea, and land Israeli attacks, mostly in refugee camps, if you notice all of them on that. They foiled 50 or 60 Western and Israeli so-called peace plans since 1949. All these plans are aimed to do one thing: let us resettle the Palestinians anywhere in the world except in their countries. But they have 170 UN members on their side, and the growing number of young people in the West actually on their side. And the 3rd generation of refugees know where they come from. And now they are camping on the armistice line, watching their land this Friday and every Friday until as much as possible. So Ben Gurion is wrong when he said the young will forget. They did not. But in the last 100 years, I want to remind you, more of you as scholars, I would like anyone to challenge me on this point. Not one oppressive regime survived in the last 100 years. Nazism, fascism, formal communism, European colonialism in all Asia, in all Africa, institutionalized discrimination, apartheid, all gone, except in Israel. And there are no moral or legal or geographic or demographic or economic or logistic reason why Palestinians cannot return. But the Israel racist and apartheid policy, and it must be abolished. And this is the job of every person in the world who have good conscience. Let us abolish that.
Wasn't that great? So I'll ask the panelists to please get to the head table. The title of this panel was UNRWA, Activism, Legislation, and Right of Return. I believe that our panelists have most ably addressed these issues. And for the question and answers, I repeat, please short, clear questions. Introduce yourself and identify yourself with any affiliation, if any. And hopefully we will finish this session in time for our fabulous sandwiches. So, Dr. Abu Ghaffar, you've been raising your hand all day. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'll come to you.
I'm Dr. Musa, and I live in this area.
I'll come to you.
I heard a lot about the law of return and so on. I just want to mention one thing, that the Israelis or the Jews, after 50 generations, 3,000 years, divide them, it came to my mind that 50 generations, they have the right to come. While our, or the PA president, not my president, denied the law of return, and he is not going back to Safed. Can anybody explain this to me?
All right. Would you care to answer that, Zena, please?
Sure. I mean, it's the, sorry, let me know if you can't hear me.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a perennial paradox, right, between, Zionist claims of return going back 3,000 years, but 3,000 years, right, but it's expected that Palestinians would forget in a generation or two. I mean, in terms of the PA adopting that sort of stance, I mean, we were all shocked when Abu Mazen said he didn't want to go back to Safed and would relinquish that. I think it's further speaks to how the PA doesn't really represent the rights of Palestinians globally, and also doesn't necessarily have a mandate to do that in any case. I mean, my father's family are from modern-day Israel. The PA doesn't cover any of that land, has never had any mandate. And when we speak of return, we don't speak of just return to the West Bank, we speak of return to the entirety. Yeah, I mean, I agree with your point.
I need to be reminded that Lamis is with us. Lamis, I saw you itching to answer. Please go ahead.
I wasn't itching to answer, but I'm happy to give a brief answer. Building on what Zena said, the reason that the PA has been able to make such statements and to relinquish and render a footnote the Palestinian right to return and the Palestinian refugees is for two reasons, and we have to discuss them honestly, because we can't have progress unless we're engaging in honest analysis and discourse. And our struggle is discursive as much as it is military or solidarity. So the first issue we have to be clear about is that the Palestinian Authority itself has fragmented the Palestinian national body. And the Palestinian national body does not just reside in the West Bank. Certainly they are in Gaza and they are in the refugee camps and in, strewn about the four corners of the earth. Yet none of them are allowed to participate in the political processes that speak for their names. And that has to change if we are able to ensure that somebody representing allegedly the Palestinian people or the Palestinian struggle, we have to hold them accountable when they try to say, oh, I I relinquish my right to return. Well, where's the accountability? We need Palestinians involved in Palestinian political processes. And then there's the issue of both what I touched upon earlier, the conditions of the PLO mission being in the United States, in DC, and Palestinian Authority direct financial interest in kind of towing a line that's always been antithetical to Palestinian participation and Palestinian interests. So we have to be, we have to be honest about that, and we have to start working, especially as Palestinians in the U.S., on ways of ending and dismantling this kind of system that has allowed this to happen.
Thank you, Lamis. Next questions for Dr. Ramadan.
I'm Tawfiq Ramadan from Oklahoma. This massive warlike attack on Palestinian right by the head of the administration, his group, the policymaker, and other institutions, does it reflect the public opinion? And if it is yes, why? Especially in this time where information is available to every American on the tip of their hands.
Okay.
Do we want to take a few
Yeah,
questions?
you can go ahead and answer, then we'll have a few. It'll be fine.
Well, I think it's on. I think many of Trump's policies are an accurate reflection of the public opinion of the base who elected him. Absolutely. I don't think it's an accurate indication of overall public opinion in the United States, and especially public opinion amongst younger, more diverse, more progressive communities that are encapsulated by the people who are in power today.
Yeah, the gentleman in the far back, please, and then we'll go to this side.
So this is for Josh Ruebner. So when he was discussing Obamacare in 2014, our current acting attorney general said that states can nullify federal law, quote, if they have the political courage. If that ring is on the table, we might as well use it. Do you think that anything can or should be done at the state level to combat these federal anti-boycott bills or the Kenneth Marcus agenda with the Department of Education?
Yeah, that's a great question. It would be great if state legislators passed resolutions reaffirming Americans' First Amendment right to boycott for Palestinian rights.
We have a question from the left side of the room.
I don't know who exactly to address, but maybe Ms. Lamis. The question that I'm just constantly puzzled about, why is not incorporated into these court cases or something, the fact that in 1947, the chief rabbi of Palestine pleaded, as I quote, "We furthermore wish to express our definite opposition to a Jewish state in any part of Palestine," which was the overwhelming community of Jews that were living there for hundreds of years. We bear witness to that, the Jewish communities around the world who are actually constantly demonstrating against the occupation because it's against our religion, and that the Jews are being arrested and beaten in the streets of Jerusalem. Anybody can witness that, the religious Jews. And these were the communities that were there for hundreds of years. They were religious Jewish communities. They oppose, as we say, that the Torah forbids us to occupy another people or to have even a Jewish state in any matter, shape, or form. That's a fact of Judaism. Why isn't that incorporated into these, the technical, into the police in the international courts?
I mean, I think it's a good point. Zionism is a political ideology, and there's, unfortunately, it's been this conflation between, an ethnic religious movement and a clear sort of realpolitik that's going on. I actually think the most interesting part of your question or your comment is actually on the Palestinian Jews who lived in Palestine. I think one of the biggest casualties of what's happened over the last 70 years have been the Mizrahim, or the Arab Jews, who in many cases were fled or expelled neighboring countries who cannot return themselves. And when we talk about right of return, we're also talking about, the ability for Arab Jews to return to the lands from which they came, which historically have lived very peacefully and under very prosperous conditions in their home countries, particularly the Iraqi Jewish community. 150,000 Jewish Iraqis lived in Baghdad alone. So when we're talking about Israel today, I mean, it's a question of understanding the way that white supremacy plays into this. And I think this is something that Josh was highlighting. Palestine is becoming a progressive issue, and so people who stand against, who are for racial justice, who are for progressive issues, you know, like fighting white supremacy, like fighting mass incarceration, like fighting all the ills of contemporary society, being pro-Palestinian is part and parcel of that, simply because Zionism is an ethno-religious ideology which upholds a supremacist structural organization of society, which all people are incumbent to oppose. It's not a question of, you know, one religious group supporting something or one ethnicity supporting something else. Anyone, as Dr. Salman Abu Sitta said, anyone with a conscience really is obliged to uphold this in the same way that they are obliged to uphold the ills of society all over the world. And so recognizing those wrongs where they've happened and seeking to rectify them should really take front and center in the debate.
Now we'll take 3 questions from the center. George, Saeed. Sorry. Oh, Lamis, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so just one tiny point to the point that the rabbi raised, and the question that the other man raised earlier to Josh. Just 2 things, because it's my goal in joining any conference or any gathering, not just to tell you what I think, but really I hope for us to be able to coordinate and elevate the type of work that we do. To the end about the exclusion of Jewish voices, specifically the exclusion of anti-Zionist and non-Zionist Jewish voices and roles, I think that's very important. Of course, what's happened is that Zionist movements, Jewish, Christian, and otherwise, have erased these voices and have been part and parcel complicit in the oppression of these voices. And what I think we need to do, and I say this to the people in the room, especially in light of the space that's been made to take new legal strategies because of the closure of the PLO mission, is to more creatively approach our legal strategy domestically and internationally now, building from the point the man said about, you know, states having space to ignore federal law. Well, the same way that we've had sanctuary cities who've rejected ICE or sanctuary communities, I think we need to be doing the same thing for Palestinian speech and for anti-Zionist and non-Zionist Jews. So I think, you know, using our creativity and our resources and our capacity, we incorporate the point brought up into our legal strategy and into our activist strategy in new ways, not just through the rallies and the BDS, but in new ways.
So the next 3 questions will come from George, Saeed, and Yusuf. If you ask him, make him short, we'll have the panelists address the 3 of them.
Yes, it's a very short question. Do we have a value of the property that Palestinians lost?
I believe Dr.
Whether land or property. Is there a value for it?
I don't have the number for you. Dr. Abu Sitta is not with us. He could have answered that. Saeed?
I have a very quick question to...
Oh, I'll give her a chance.
I have a quick question to Josh Ruebner. More and more we hear that Israel is becoming a partisan issue, okay? But other than this small group of progressives and so on within the Democratic Party, as long as the money keeps flowing, I don't see how that could impact the policy-making process. Could you share with us your sentiments on this? Thank you.
Yusuf, you want to ask your question, and we'll have the panelists address them.
Yes, Yusuf Khan, for writer, independent writer. What is the status of taking Israel to the ICC, which include massacres, war crimes, collective punishment, checkpoints, imprisonment of children? What is the status of that?
Should I ask Lamis to respond first before I forget about it?
I can respond at the end when everybody else responds if you want to take more questions, but it's up to you.
We have 2 questions on the table.
Okay, so I'm happy to address the first and the last question that were answered. The man who brought up the question of the valuation of the property that was lost and stolen by Zionists and Israelis belonging to the Palestinians, I think it's important to note that this is a very contentious issue because some people tie it to the monetization of the Palestinian struggle and demands. And there's a fear that if we start calculating, then people will say, can we offer you this money in exchange for your right to return? And there has been a trend to do that. I, on the other hand, while I understand this fear, understand that, you know, return and justice are just part of the equation. Palestinians are owed restitution and reparations. And there was one report that came close to trying to monetize the harm that Israel has done to the Palestinian GDP, and estimated at somewhere between 80 to 85% of Israeli GDP is stolen directly from Palestinians. And I don't think this goes back to 1948. So this is a contentious issue that I think we need to balance, negotiate, and think about. Regarding the ICC, my understanding as of last was that there was a call for affidavits and evidence to be submitted to the special prosecutor for the time period in question, focusing on Gaza and hopefully to the West Bank. I don't know what progress has been made in issuing those witness statements, survivor statements, and affidavits. But again, the closing of the PLO mission is a blessing in disguise, right? So we get to have the opportunity to be able to push for this in more meaningful ways. And hopefully we will see not a PA-focused initiative to get affidavits and witness statements and testimonies, but a broader grassroots effort to do that. And I'm hoping to be part of it. And I just saw Ali Abu Ni'ma kind of walk around the new room, and I just wanted to say hi. I didn't get to see him in person, but it's nice to see him on camera.
Right. Any other comments from the panelists?
We had a question addressed to you. Sure, I'll just address the first question briefly, going off what Lamis was saying. I don't know the exact figure. Salman Abu Sitta has done extensive work on this. I think it raises an interesting and salient point about not just the Palestinian bodies who are displaced, but actually assets and what that meant for Palestine.
The land is not for sale. Absolutely. The land is not for sale. Why are you going to estimate the price?
Well, I think the importance of it,
in the first place.
I think the point of it, or perhaps the most interesting part of that question, though, is that future Palestinian losses. Palestinians are an agrarian society, and when Palestinians, it's not, no, forgive me but I don't think the question was actually. No, I don't think the question was about how much does the land cost. I think it was how much did Palestinians lose monetarily speaking. And it's important to address. I mean, when we look at indigenous losses in this country, we're not talking about, okay, we want indigenous Americans to get X much in return, or, you know, this land that they were sitting on had this much, but it's assigning value to things that goes beyond just their bodies and just their natural rights. And so, you know, when a Palestinian gets displaced, yes, a Palestinian body has been displaced, but not just that, the land in which they tilled and that they lived off was also taken from them. And the loss of their livelihood is mapped out in these sorts of ways. I mean, if I were to just think about Ghassan Kanafani's Rajaf al-Shams, he's this whole section on how we had the olive trees and we had this and we had all these groves, and now we're relying on UNRWA for sacks of flour. The point that he's making isn't that, you know, we lost our land and we lost our money. It's that we can no longer be independent and we can no longer feed ourselves and our futures because the land has been taken. I think that's the important point. So it's less a question of just, you know, the monetary value of the Nakba, but it's actually a question of what dispossession meant for future generations of Palestinians. Palestinians, you know, I mean, the GDP in Palestine, just in the West Bank now, I think is 3,000, whereas in Israel it's about 38,000. I'm happy to be corrected. I think that's just the latest figures that I read. That's a huge disparity. Why are Palestinians so financially worse off? Of course, it's the occupation and the whole infrastructure set up, but it's also because Palestinians were an agrarian society, and now we are no longer in possession of the land. So when we talk about assets, it's not a question of we want, you know, the money back or we want whatever and we'll call it quits. It's actually a question of you didn't just take our lands, but you took our futures and what we could have done with that land. I don't know if that's, I mean, I don't know if that's the direction you took it in, but that's how I read the question at least.
Anybody else want to comment from the panelists? No.
No question.
I'll answer Saeed's question.
Yeah, okay, go ahead, please.
You know, Saeed, this is a very important question
something that could occupy a couple of hours of conversation. There's some interesting trends underway. J Street raised $5 million for Democratic candidates in the midterm, and they now claim that not only are they the largest pro-Israel PAC, but that they're larger than all of the pro-Israel PACs combined. And I haven't checked their math yet, but I don't dispute their claim. So it's very interesting to see how the balance of power is shifting in that regard, and I think that creates its own challenges regarding mobilizing progressive members of Congress to advocate for Palestinian rights, because let's be very clear, J Street is not an organization that advocates for Palestinian rights in any fashion whatsoever. To get a J Street endorsement, and this is why they took their endorsement away from Rashida Tlaib, to get their endorsement, you have to pledge not only to support military aid to Israel, but ever-increasing amounts of military aid to Israel. And there are other conditions to getting a J Street endorsement as well. So as J Street becomes an ever larger component of the Israel lobby, it becomes increasingly dangerous to the advancement of Palestinian rights from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, because there's very much a gatekeeper effect in play here, where, and we've seen this, I won't name names, but we've seen this with a number of members of Congress who will go up to the J Street line, but not go beyond it, even if it contradicts their progressive values. So it's a huge, huge issue. There's no reason why those who advocate for Palestinian rights can't play this same game. And I think that another important component to look at is the democratization of money through the electoral system. Whether, I think really President Obama was the first to really display this in terms of large-scale, small donations really powering campaigns, and this was amplified in Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016. You look at Beto O'Rourke's Senate campaign, and you see the power of small, aggregated contributions to really fuel campaigns that make an impact on the national scale. So I don't see any reason why this cannot be replicated for those candidates who truly believe in Palestinian rights.
Thank you. Anybody who wants to understand the Palestinian problem should pay attention to the emotion with which Dr. Khilfa spoke. And I believe that that's the feeling of every Palestinian I've ever met. So there's a unanimous feeling about that, the value of the land and the attachment of the Palestinian people to it. And policymakers who tend to shove that under the rug have no idea about what they're doing. The next question is from the far right there.
Dan Lieberman. Well, just to clear it up, I do have some figures here that Adawi, I don't know who he is, land expert assisted by the economist Cabrusi, estimated the total value of mobile and immobile property to be $3 billion in 1948. And he estimated the human capital losses and everything, and considering inflation, it rises to $560 billion in this year. So it's quite a bit of money. But I do have some comments. It was mentioned briefly that there are a lot of Israelis who live out of the country. I believe it could be as much as 1 million. And these who live outside of the country actually have taken citizenship. I think I've lost this. Have actually taken citizenship of other countries. So if you, they are really not Israeli citizens. So that lowers the Israeli Jewish citizenship from 550 million, from 5.5 million to 4.5 million. And then if you take the firstborn, in other words, those who were actually born in the country, I think you lowers the total to only 3 million Israelis, and you have 1.5 million Palestinians. So if you look at it from another perspective, the Palestinians are much stronger in Israel. And one other comment was mentioned, the laws, the UN and laws. No one likes to mention the G word, but there's also a UN definition of genocide. And unfortunately, that genocide does meet the Palestinian condition today. No one likes to use the G word, but according to the UN, the Palestinians are undergoing a genocide.
Thank you very much. We'll take a couple more questions. The lady here, I keep looking to the right, and it's her turn. Then the young man in the back, and then Dr. Gharib had a question. And then we'll conclude with that.
And Michael, I just wanted to follow up on the question of the value of things and what's involved. The whole issue of reparations or what you do, it's ironic that it was, and in fact, the Jews in Israel who set a lot of the precedents, like after the Second World War, the return of property, the turn of cultural stuff, the turn of, I mean, more than just land, the businesses, the value of all of that, and the same after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And I know the Palestine Center has had programs here about the stolen libraries of Palestinians, the stolen films, I mean, the cultural heritage that the Israelis have that is enriching their institutions that belongs to the Palestinian people that needs to be returned. And I don't know whether any of the panel wants to sort of address this, but I think this is another aspect that changes how people think about this whole thing when they realize how broad the occupation and the takeover of Palestine is, and the efforts to sort of erase everything from the map and from history and from the culture. And that shows up in that disparity between the average wealth of an Israeli and of a Palestinian, because it's not just their land, it's their money, it's their cultural heritage and all the stuff they owned.
Very good. Let's take a question from the young man in the back, and then the last question for Dr. Gharib, and then we will, Dr. Gharib declines.
Hello, this is Anas Jnena. I'm from Gaza. Just arrived to the United States 2.5 weeks ago. So yeah, we made it, guys. Actually, I would first like to really thank all of you here, the participants, the coordinators. You know, for someone who's been out of Gaza for the first time, it's really refreshing, and it gives me hope to see a lot of people really caring, attending, even Jewish people. That's a really nice scene to me. So thank you all. And right to my question, in Gaza, in fact, most people feel unrepresented. I mean, the PA is the international body that is, internationally recognized, and it's the, the body that the world countries want to deal with. And I don't feel, as a Gazan, I mean, most youth my age especially do not feel like they're well represented by the PA. And you've got the PA even punishes people in Gaza. I mean, probably some people wouldn't like the word punish, but if you are a PA employee in Gaza, your salary is cut by half, and you starting from 8 months ago or so, the PA imposed procedures against Gaza, against its own employees. So if you're in Ramallah, you get 100% salary, but if you're in Gaza, you get 50% of your salary. And the PA stopped paying for the electricity bills for Israel to provide gas or supply electricity. So this is, to me, is outrageous. And I feel really sorry to keep on fighting and pushing against all the wrong and unjust decisions the world leaders might do to the Palestinians, while at the same time my representation, the PA, is doing just the opposite. It's punishing the people. I mean, I wish it could, I wish it could say it affects Hamas. It does not. It does not affect but the people there. And I'm wondering, what do we do? I mean, to what extent do we really trust this? Dr. Riyad Mansour early on talked about steadfastness, but how can you provide people with steadfastness and courage when you're, the PA at the same time just punishes the people to cut their salaries? I mean, this is so hypocritical for me, and I'm wondering, what do I do as a Gazan? I mean, look at the youth in Gaza. 60% of the people among youth are unemployed. This is unbelievable. And if you are employed, you get like like 800 shekels, which is $200 a month. It's so cheap, and the people really, the young people especially, feel just left alone and nobody cares about them. Even my journey here to the US, I'm really sad to say that neither the PA nor any Palestinian official could help me get out, but a US senator. Yeah, I'm gonna say it. Thanks to Senator Chris Vollenholland. He was the one who sort of helped, facilitate the coordination or getting the Israeli permission and all of that. And I could not get the help of a Palestinian Authority official. Though if I could, it would have been much easier. It's crazy and it's hypocritical to keep on criticizing, all of others while we have all the troubles at home too. I'm not saying, but I'm saying this takes also and needs to be focused on as well.
We feel your pain for sure, okay? So let's take the final question, and then we'll have the panelists address him, and we will move on. Right there, please.
Hi, sorry, that was emotional. Okay, I have a little bit of a sort of a big following on social media, and all I can do is try to expose what's happening and bring awareness, because social media is a pretty powerful tool, as we all know right now.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is to you, Josh. If you had one thing to tell an audience, average, everyday Americans who are starting to support Palestine, or Palestinians who are not necessarily activists, but are just sitting at home, housewives, whatever, that want to do something, okay, what do we tell them to start doing here in the United States? What is the first thing we need to do as a people that are supporting Palestine, Americans, Palestinian Americans? What would be the first thing that comes to your mind that they can do from home, a phone call, a letter to a policymaker? What would be your first suggestion to tell the masses to get involved? I know that's a big question, but politically.
Yeah. Panelists, answers and concluding remarks, please.
Oof, should I go first?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to just quickly address the woman in the corner who spoke about the question of cultural heritage being lost, and then I'm going to address a gentleman from Gaza, and then just briefly with my ideas. So I think something that it perhaps is most detrimental, in addition to the loss of cultural heritage, is actually the closure of archives to Palestinian scholars and to other scholars generally. It's very, very difficult for Palestinians who study their own history, let alone, in addition to Palestinians abroad and scholars internationally, to actually access any of the archives in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, some of the military archives. And so for many, and any time that they've looted, so in 1982 in Lebanon was a prime example when they occupied, the result of that was all of the PLO documents end up back in the Israeli archives. And so this has a really detrimental impact on the scholarship that is produced and hinders what we know about this and anything we can do in terms of furthering our cause through well-documented and rigorous research. And this is coming to light more and more. In response to the gentleman at the back, I know, well, first of all, welcome. This country is in many ways much more screwed up than you'll see from the outside. Trust me, I say it as an outsider. But I think I just have 3 points. First of all, I think it's time that we see the PA as a contractor, a subcontractor of the Israeli government. The PA is not a, the trick's in the name. It went from Palestinian Liberation Organization to Palestinian Authority. It's an authoritative power in the West Bank, and it punishes people according to dissent. And that's not how the future Palestine that we're fighting for is. There haven't been elections in Palestine for the last 14 years, I think. This isn't, the PA by no means represents Palestinians, and I think it is high time that we clean up our house with regards to highlighting the way the Palestinian Authority complicity is in the Israeli occupation. While recognizing that these are Israeli practices and they enlist Palestinian support through the Palestinian Authority. And Human Rights Watch has issued a very good report on the way that, essentially torture and hostile interrogation tactics towards Palestinians is implemented by both Hamas and Fatah. And that's something we just don't talk about when we talk about this issue. But there is work being done. I mean, particularly when Basil al-Araj was assassinated in Palestine 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago now. There was a lot of global mobilization against, ending the coordination between the Sulta and the PA and the Israeli regime. And so I think increased efforts towards that is a really important and long overdue discussion, and not legitimizing the Palestinian Authority as a voice for Palestinians, which I guess ties into an earlier comment that was made. The second point I want to make, you spoke about unemployment in Gaza. This is something that, also doesn't get much airtime, and I think the threats to UNRWA directly challenge that. A huge number of Palestinian refugees in Gaza are employed by UNRWA, schools, hospitals, whatever. And then any threats to UNRWA also threaten further destabilize an already unstable situation. And what we've seen with the latest cuts is UNRWA actually had to temporarily evacuate from Gaza because their staff were ostensibly at risk because 100 Palestinians were laid off, which in a place like Gaza is the end of your livelihood. And I would actually, if you wanted to read, anyone who wanted to read more about this, Sarah Roy, who spoke at this conference last year, has done exquisite research on this, and she wrote a phenomenal piece in the London Review of Books on the desperation that many are feeling. The last thing I want to say is there are glimmers of hope from Gaza insofar as I know everyone always talks about Gaza sky geeks and whatever, but the tech scene is actually quite burgeoning. Palestinians are very innovative and enterprising with without any tools, as it were, so using technology really to their advantage. And I think if there were ways in which there are more international programs to strengthen Palestinian digital rights and digital innovation, I think that would go a long way. And finally, if there were one ask, so I guess from a policy perspective, Betty McCollum's bill is huge and really needs support. But I mean, no one's under any illusions that it's going to pass. I think it's just a question of the fact that it happened at all. BDS is crucial, but since it's also so sort of at risk, is also, I think, makes it a bit of a liability for people who don't want to get into the quagmire, which is ridiculous considering it's a boycott which this country has always heralded as the way of achieving liberation. But I actually think that one thing we always hear is, oh, it's so complicated, and actually I think that's a very good propaganda tool of the Israeli government, to just don't deal with it, it's too complicated, let the grown-ups deal with it. Yes, parts of it are very complicated, areas A, B, and C, the different zones, H1, H2 in Hebron, blah, 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 all the wars, all the negotiations, all of that is complicated in the sense that it's dense historically speaking, but the crux of the matter is actually very straightforward. And I think a good messaging to get across is that we're talking about settler colonialism here, and in addressing settler colonialism, this is how it's upheld and this is how it needs to be dismantled. And focusing on that, and then again making it, I find that there's somewhat of a solipsism in the way that Americans understand themselves and read their news and read media. And I think bringing it back home and highlighting the connections between the US and Israel in terms of shared practices and shared values has actually been a really powerful tool of unknitting this blind support.
So Betty McCollum's bill, what you're saying is supported in which way? How can the masses support that bill? Do they write in?
They can call to we call up the House and just your representatives and say, why aren't you supporting this bill? I mean, if you live in a democratic state, I don't know what the point would be, but it'd be worth a shot, I suppose. Anyway.
Who wants the next shot? Josh and then Lamis, and then we'll move to lunch.
Sure. Of course, it's incredibly important for individuals to contact their members of Congress, phone calls, emails, show up at town hall meetings, but let's be honest about the power of individuals. If we're going to dramatically shift power in this country by changing institutional practices, that can't be done at an individual level. You can't engage in BDS on an individual level, except for very personal consumer choices that you might make, which have absolutely no repercussions because it's not a public act. So to engage in fundamental transformation and building power, there is very little we can do as individuals. We have to engage in collectivities. We have to organize ourselves into powerful blocks that can move power and transform the policies of institutions.
Lamis, you want to say something?
Yes, please. I want to just first address أنس زنانة. أنس الحمد لله على سلامتك وشكرا لوجودك ولمجهودك بغزة على الأرض الطاهرة ومعنا. To address his point on the failures of the Palestinian Authority and how we can overcome them. You know, I'm sure that everybody there knows, especially you, Anas, and my Palestinian compatriots there today, that Palestinians in the West Bank rely heavily, because they've been forced to rely heavily on the quote-unquote administration of the Palestinian Authority. But at the same time, they deeply reject en masse Palestinian Authority policies, especially vis-a-vis Gaza, and we saw that over the past year. And what I have to offer is not a critique that's available, but really just, again, ideas for what I think is important to build and work on to get rid of this issue. First, Palestinians really need to join, and their allies really need to support the international Palestinian movement to democratize the PLO and the PNC. This is critical in undoing a lot of what we're seeing. Second, we have to hold accountable all actors, including the PA, who are not just complicit, but actually advancing the siege against Gaza. And third, and this is where Anas, you come in, and Zena, you come in, and all the Palestinians in the room come in. Because we've been forced to rely, especially post-1994, on all of these organizations and administrations that impose conditions, what we need to do is return and refine and perfect the ability of Palestinians to become self-reliant and mutually reliant on dignified forms of economic support and funding, and not on charity. And this is critical to avoiding ever having to be put in a position where we're dependent on those who do not care nor wish for the safety and success and survival of all of our people. Yes, number two, the second question, it is no short irony that in the same year that the UN General Assembly took to defining or adopting the definition of genocide was the same year that 2/3 of the Palestinian population was ethnically cleansed of their land. That same year also, the UN General Assembly refused to refer to a special prosecutor, Israel and the Zionists, for prosecution. So lesson learned. My last point is about reparations and restitution and this issue. And this is very important to share because it's something that I hope everybody kind of includes in their discourse and in their approach to Palestine and what Palestinian justice looks like. We have many models to look at for what succeeded for refugees. The Bosnian model, good and bad. The South African model, good and bad. And the Guatemalan model in particular, also good and bad. In the Guatemalan model, there were several factions and communities that had made demands. The only Guatemalan communities that had their demands met were the communities that, first of all, called and demanded all of their rights. You know, reparations and restitution are distinct. Reparations is political, restitution is direct, and return is also distinct. Called for all three. They included this in their constitution verbatim. And three, very importantly, they kept and maintained an armed force that was ready to engage in armed struggle should those three demands not be met. And they are the only ones that were able to exact and receive everything that they had wanted. And in closing, I bring it back to our fallen heroes and our people in the prisons in the United States and in Palestine, that there is no element of the Palestinian movement, especially those who are advancing and protecting and calling for full Palestinian rights, that anybody is entitled to call for their criminalization or even for their defamation in the context of our movement. We have to protect each other. The marginalization of any member of our community and our struggle is a threat to all of us, which must be taken seriously. And I thank the Jerusalem Fund and everybody and my co-panelists today.
Thank you, Lamis.
Bye, guys.
You had You had a taste of the emotions expressed by Palestinians, a very diverse spectrum of opinions. It's obvious that the Palestine Center here provides a forum for people to speak their mind and air their grievances and how they feel. I personally enjoyed the learning I had at the hands of these panelists and your questions. And I would ask you to please join me in thanking them for their contributions and to get to lunch. Thank you.